The cruelest betrayal is not when your enemies stop fearing you. It is when the people who once loved you stop seeing you. Ethan Moretti had spent 15 years building an empire that stretched from the glittering skyline of Manhattan to the quiet suburbs where no one dared speak his name above a whisper. Yet none of that power followed him into the silent bedroom, where morning sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors and settled over the motionless figure lying in a custom hospital bed. The doctors called it a life-changing spinal injury after a devastating accident, careful to avoid promises they could not keep. And although they assured everyone his mind remained as sharp as ever, the world outside those walls had already begun treating him like a man whose story had ended. Every morning the mansion awakened with the familiar rhythm of expensive shoes crossing marble, distant conversations between security personnel, the aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the quiet rustle of staff beginning another day. But fewer footsteps ever reached Ethan's room. The executives who once requested his opinion suddenly accepted meetings with someone else. The captains who had waited hours outside his office now found reasons to avoid looking into his eyes. Even the silence had changed, becoming heavier, colder, almost embarrassed to remain beside him. Then the bedroom door opened. Ethan expected to see Victoria Sinclair, the elegant fiancée who had once promised they would face every storm together. Yet instead it was Naomi Carter, the newest maid in the household, carrying a small crystal vase filled with fresh white lilies. She could not have been older than 28, her dark curls neatly tied back, her black housekeeping uniform perfectly pressed despite beginning work before sunrise. She walked with calm confidence, replacing the faded flowers beside his bed before opening the curtains just enough to let warm light enter without shining directly into his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," she said gently. "It's supposed to reach 72 degrees today. I thought you might like to see a little sunshine." Ethan offered no reply. During the past 3 months, he had learned that pity often arrived disguised as kindness, and he wanted neither. Naomi seemed unbothered by his silence. She straightened a picture frame that had tilted slightly overnight, adjusted the blanket covering his legs with quiet respect, then stepped back instead of hovering over him. She never rushed. She never sighed. She never spoke to him as though he were a burden. Minutes later, the door opened again, and Victoria entered wearing an immaculate cream-colored suit, her attention fixed on the glowing screen of her phone. She barely glanced toward the man she had once called the love of her life. "I only have 5 minutes," she said without looking up. "There's another meeting downtown, and the attorneys need my signature before noon." Ethan watched her from across the room, searching for the warmth that used to soften her voice whenever she spoke his name, but all he found was polite obligation. She placed a quick kiss against his forehead, already stepping backward toward the hallway before he could answer. "Take care," she added absent-mindedly. "Naomi will make sure you have everything you need." The door clicked shut almost as quickly as it had opened. The room fell silent again until Naomi quietly moved the untouched breakfast tray closer to his bedside. "Whenever you're ready," she said with the same calm dignity she had carried from the moment she entered. A king should never have to eat cold eggs. For the first time since losing the ability to stand, Ethan looked directly at someone and wondered why the only person who still treated him like the man he used to be was the one person who owed him nothing at all. The days settled into a rhythm that felt painfully predictable, yet every sunrise revealed another quiet reminder that the world had already begun moving without Ethan Moretti. From the tall windows of his bedroom, he could see black luxury sedans arriving one after another, carrying executives, attorneys, and longtime associates who once refused to make a single important decision without his approval. Now they walked past his door without slowing their pace, following Victoria into the conference room at the opposite end of the mansion. Their conversations drifted faintly through the hallway, full of financial reports, expansion plans, and investment opportunities, but no one bothered asking whether Ethan wished to participate. It was as though the mansion itself had accepted a new center of gravity. Only Naomi continued following the old routine. Every morning, she polished his shoes, even though he could no longer wear them outside. She selected one of his tailored jackets from the enormous walk-in closet and carefully hung it where he could see it. She adjusted the antique watch collection displayed beside his bookshelf, winding each timepiece exactly as the previous house manager had taught her. To anyone else, those gestures might have seemed unnecessary, even foolish, but Naomi understood something no one else seemed willing to remember. Dignity was built through ordinary rituals. One afternoon, Ethan finally broke the silence that had surrounded them for weeks. "Why do you keep preparing clothes I cannot use?" His voice carried frustration rather than curiosity. Naomi folded a fresh hand towel before answering. "Because one difficult season should not erase the man you have always been." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "That man is gone." Naomi looked at him without pity, something he had begun noticing about her more each day. "No, sir. Walking into a room never made you a leader. The way people felt when you entered did." Her words lingered long after she left the room. Later that evening, Victoria stopped by again, dressed elegantly for another charity gala that would undoubtedly generate flattering headlines. She stood near the doorway while replying to text messages, occasionally glancing at the expensive watch around her wrist. "The board approved the restructuring," she announced casually. "Everything is under control." Ethan frowned. "I was never asked to review it." Victoria forced a polite smile. "You need to focus on your recovery. Stress is the last thing your doctors recommend." Before he could respond, her phone rang again. She apologized, answered the call, and walked into the hallway, continuing the conversation without looking back. Through the partially opened door, Ethan heard laughter in her voice, light and effortless, a sound he had not heard inside his room for months. Naomi entered moments later carrying a tray with homemade chicken soup instead of the expensive catered meals the nutritionist usually ordered. She noticed the untouched expression on Ethan's face before noticing the empty doorway. Without asking questions, she quietly placed the tray beside him and adjusted the napkin across his lap. "Soup?" she asked softly. Ethan stared toward the hallway where Victoria had disappeared. "Tell me something honestly, Naomi." She nodded. "Do people stop seeing you because you change, or because changing makes them uncomfortable?" Naomi remained silent for several seconds before answering with calm certainty. "The people who truly see you never stop looking, sir. Everyone else was only admiring the crown." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the steaming bowl resting before him, realizing that inside a mansion filled with hundreds of employees, endless luxury, and people eager to inherit influence, the only person protecting what remained of his spirit was the woman quietly making certain his lunch stayed warm. By the beginning of the 4th month, the mansion had perfected the uncomfortable art of pretending Ethan Moretti no longer existed. Staff members still greeted him politely whenever they entered his room, but conversations ended the moment they noticed he was listening. Invitations for charity events, business dinners, and foundation galas no longer arrived on the silver tray that once rested beside his desk. The office downstairs remained active from sunrise until late evening, yet the leather chair where he had spent countless hours making decisions gathered a thin layer of dust. Everyone seemed determined to preserve the appearance of respect while quietly removing him from the life he had built. Everyone except Naomi. Every morning, she entered at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying the same calm energy that never asked for recognition. She opened the curtains, arranged fresh flowers, and wheeled in a small cart with breakfast prepared exactly the way Ethan had once preferred before his injury. She had memorized every detail without writing anything down. Coffee with 1 packet of raw sugar. Toast lightly browned. Fresh berries instead of melon because he never liked melon. She shaved him with slow, careful movements, always asking permission before adjusting his chair or straightening his collar. She polished his wedding band even though the ceremony had never taken place. She brushed his hair neatly before positioning a tailored navy jacket across his shoulders, not because anyone expected visitors, but because she believed a man should recognize himself whenever he looked into a mirror. One cloudy afternoon, she rolled his wheelchair onto the stone terrace overlooking the gardens. A cool breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the estate, while fountains whispered quietly in the distance. Ethan stared across the endless lawns without saying a word. Naomi stood beside him, watering the flower boxes lining the railing as though silence required no apology. After several minutes, Ethan finally spoke. "You know everyone thinks this is pointless." Naomi looked up. "What is all of this?" He gestured toward the jacket, the polished shoes resting beneath his chair, the carefully folded blanket across his lap. "Trying to make me look like the man I used to be." Naomi smiled gently before walking over and kneeling beside one of the rose bushes. She carefully removed a single dried leaf from the stem. "Do you know why gardeners remove dead leaves?" she asked. Ethan frowned. "Because they make the plant look better?" She shook her head. "Because the plant is still alive. If it were truly gone, nobody would care how it looked." Ethan watched as she stood and brushed a little soil from her gloves. "You still have dreams, memories, wisdom, and choices. Those are not carried by your legs, sir. They are carried by your character." For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to look directly at his own reflection in the terrace window. The face staring back appeared older and more tired than he remembered, but the suit resting across his shoulders fit perfectly. His hair was neatly combed, and his posture remained straight despite everything he had lost. He barely noticed that he was sitting taller until Naomi quietly adjusted the blanket one final time. "There," she said with quiet satisfaction. "Now the world can see what I see." Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. "And what is that?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "A man who deserves to be treated with the same respect on his hardest day that he earned on his strongest one." Her words settled over the quiet garden like the afternoon sunlight breaking through the clouds. And for the first time since his life had changed, Ethan felt something inside him begin to awaken that no doctor, therapist, or expensive treatment had been able to restore. It was not strength. It was hope. The following week brought a subtle change that no one else inside the mansion seemed to notice except Ethan himself. His room no longer felt like a place where time had stopped. Every morning Naomi found small ways to return pieces of his old life without pretending nothing had changed. She placed the daily newspaper beside his favorite reading chair, even though he could not sit there yet. She organized business magazines on the bookshelf exactly as they had been before the accident. She opened the windows for a few minutes every afternoon so the fresh autumn air could replace the sterile scent of medicine. The room slowly began feeling less like a recovery suite and more like the home of a man who still belonged to the world. Ethan found himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, something that surprised him more than he cared to admit. One morning, while Naomi carefully adjusted the cuff of his crisp white shirt, Ethan studied her expression. She always worked with complete concentration, never rushing through a task simply because no one else considered it important. Finally, he asked the question that had been quietly growing in his mind for weeks. "Why are you still here?" Naomi paused only long enough to smooth the fabric across his shoulder. "Because this is my job, sir." Ethan shook his head gently. "No, I have watched people leave this house one by one. Some stopped visiting. Some stopped calling. Others only come when they need something signed. You could have requested another assignment weeks ago. Why did you not?" Naomi stepped back and looked at him with the same calm honesty that had become so familiar. "Because you are still here." Ethan frowned. "That is not an answer." She smiled softly. "It is the only answer that matters." The room became quiet except for the faint ticking of the antique clock resting above the fireplace. Naomi picked up his tailored navy blazer and carefully placed it across his shoulders. "When I walked into this mansion for the first time, everyone told me to be careful around you. They described your influence, your reputation, and your success. But none of those things introduced themselves to me. I met a man recovering from the hardest season of his life." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Most people only see what I lost." Naomi gently straightened the collar of his shirt before meeting his gaze. "I do not." "Then what do you see?" he asked quietly. Her answer came without hesitation. "I see someone who still thanks the kitchen staff every evening. I see someone who apologizes whenever physical therapy runs late because he worries about other people's schedules. I see someone who still asks whether the gardeners have enough equipment before asking about his own comfort. Those things did not disappear after your accident." Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. For months he had measured himself by everything he could no longer do. He had forgotten there were parts of him no injury could ever touch. Naomi reached for the wheelchair handles, but waited before moving him, as she always did. "May I?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "You always ask." Naomi answered with quiet certainty. Respect is not something people earn only when life is easy. As she guided him toward the terrace once again, Ethan noticed several employees working in the gardens below. Some looked up briefly before returning to their tasks, but for the first time he no longer wondered whether they pitied him. His attention remained on the woman walking behind his chair, the one person in the mansion who had never spoken to him as though he were broken. In her presence, he was not a patient, a burden, or yesterday's leader. He was simply Ethan Moretti, and somehow that simple truth felt more valuable than every title he had ever held. As autumn slowly settled over the estate, the mansion became busier than ever, yet the distance between Ethan Moretti and the people around him continued to grow. Luxury cars arrived before sunrise and departed long after sunset. Attorneys carried thick folders into the conference room. Financial advisors spoke in measured voices about investments, partnerships, and future expansion. Victoria moved confidently through every meeting with effortless elegance, answering questions that once belonged to Ethan alone. Whenever someone hesitated before making an important decision, she simply smiled and assured them that Ethan needed complete peace to recover. No one questioned her. Upstairs, Ethan listened to the muffled conversations through the hallway walls, feeling less like the owner of the mansion and more like a forgotten guest inside it. Naomi never commented on the meetings downstairs. Instead, she focused on the things everyone else overlooked. She placed fresh flowers beside the family photographs every Monday morning. She rotated the books on Ethan's shelves so the sunlight would not fade their covers. She made certain every lamp cast a warm glow instead of the harsh brightness that reminded him of hospital rooms. Her care was never dramatic. It lived in quiet details. One rainy afternoon, while soft drops tapped gently against the tall windows, Ethan noticed Naomi carefully repairing the loose button on one of his favorite navy shirts instead of sending it to be replaced. That shirt could easily be thrown away, he observed. Naomi continued sewing with patient hands before looking up. It still has years left in it. Ethan smiled faintly. Most people would buy a new one. Naomi tied a neat knot in the thread. Some things are worth preserving because of what they have already carried. Ethan remained silent, sensing she was speaking about far more than a shirt. After a long pause, he finally asked, "Where did you learn to think that way?" Naomi carefully folded the finished shirt across her lap before answering. "My father served as a city bus driver for almost 30 years. Near the end of his career, he became seriously ill and spent a long time recovering at home. People who used to wave at him every morning slowly stopped visiting. They remembered the man who drove the bus, but they forgot the man sitting in the living room." Her voice never trembled, yet every word carried quiet experience. "For nearly 2 years I helped him get dressed, prepared his meals, read the newspaper with him, and listened to stories he had already told dozens of times. He used to apologize because he thought he had become a burden." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Did you ever believe he was?" Naomi answered immediately, "Never. A person's value does not disappear because life becomes difficult. Sometimes difficult seasons simply reveal who truly understands that value." Ethan stared through the rain-covered glass, remembering how often he had measured people by their achievements, their confidence, and their ability to command a room. Now, sitting quietly beside the woman mending an old shirt with careful hands, he realized that strength could look remarkably different. It could sound like patience. It could resemble kindness repeated every single day without expecting applause. Naomi placed the neatly repaired shirt into his closet exactly where it had always belonged before turning back toward him with her familiar gentle smile. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I think this one should be your first choice." Ethan nodded slowly, not because the shirt mattered, but because someone had reminded him that he still had a tomorrow worth preparing for. Outside, the rain continued falling across the gardens, washing every path clean, while inside the mansion something just as quiet had begun restoring a part of Ethan that success alone had never been able to protect. Winter arrived quietly, covering the gardens with a thin layer of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun, and with each passing week the meetings downstairs became longer, while Ethan Moretti's presence became easier for everyone to ignore. From his bedroom, he could hear voices drifting through the hall, followed by polite laughter that always seemed to end the moment someone walked past his door. The mansion remained as beautiful as ever, but Ethan had begun noticing the subtle changes hidden beneath its polished surface. Familiar advisors no longer visited him before major decisions. Financial documents that once arrived on his desk now disappeared directly into Victoria's private office. Even longtime employees avoided discussing business within earshot, not because they wished to disrespect him, but because they assumed his role had quietly become part of the past. Naomi noticed the changes as well, although she never mentioned them unless Ethan asked. One afternoon, she wheeled him toward the library, knowing it had always been his favorite room in the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounded them, filled with biographies, history books, and leather-bound journals collected over decades. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, warming the reading table where Ethan had once spent hours reviewing reports. Naomi carefully dusted the shelves while Ethan looked across the room with quiet nostalgia. As she reached for a stack of unopened mail that had been placed on the corner of the table, a large envelope slid onto the floor. Several documents slipped free. Naomi bent down to collect them, intending only to straighten the papers before returning them, but one page immediately caught her attention. Across the top appeared the familiar letterhead of one of Ethan's holding companies. Beneath it were authorization forms transferring significant decision-making authority to Victoria while temporarily suspending Ethan's approval rights because of his medical condition. Naomi frowned. She knew enough about the household to understand that Ethan had never mentioned signing anything like this. Before she could examine another page, footsteps echoed in the hallway. She quietly gathered the documents exactly as she had found them and placed them back inside the envelope just as Victoria entered the library with two attorneys following close behind. Victoria offered Naomi a pleasant smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Those papers are for today's meeting." Naomi stepped aside respectfully, but as the attorneys organized the files on the table, she noticed another document briefly exposed beneath the folder. It listed several company assets scheduled for transfer into a newly created management trust controlled entirely by Victoria until further notice. Ethan remained across the room, unaware of what had just passed before Naomi's eyes. He simply assumed another routine meeting was beginning. The attorneys soon left with Victoria, carrying the envelope away as though nothing unusual had happened. Silence returned to the library. Naomi stood beside the bookshelf for several long moments, replaying every detail in her mind. She had no proof that anything dishonest was taking place, yet something about the paperwork troubled her deeply. More than the legal language itself, it was the speed with which decisions seemed to be moving while Ethan remained isolated upstairs. As she wheeled him back toward his room, Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression. "You have been unusually quiet," he observed. Naomi looked ahead before answering carefully. "Sometimes, sir, when people believe no one is paying attention, they become less careful about the choices they make." Ethan studied her face, sensing that she had seen something she was not yet ready to explain. For the first time in many months, he realized that while everyone else had stopped watching over him, Naomi had quietly begun watching over everything that still belonged to him. The uneasiness Naomi carried after that afternoon in the library refused to fade. She had replayed every detail so many times that she could still picture the placement of every page inside the envelope, the signatures waiting at the bottom of the forms, and the confident expression on Victoria's face as she carried the documents away. Naomi knew she was only a housekeeper, not an attorney or a financial advisor, but she also knew the difference between routine paperwork and something deliberately kept away from the one person who deserved to see it. Over the next several days, she quietly observed without interfering. The meetings became increasingly private. Couriers arrived with sealed envelopes almost every afternoon. Expensive suits filled the conference room downstairs while Ethan remained upstairs, reading books, completing physical therapy, and believing that every important decision was simply being delayed until he recovered. One crisp morning, Victoria entered Ethan's room carrying a slim leather portfolio and a warm smile that felt unusually rehearsed. "I have wonderful news," she said cheerfully. "The attorneys have prepared a temporary authorization that will make daily operations much easier while you focus on getting stronger." Ethan looked toward the folder resting in her hands. "Temporary?" Victoria nodded immediately. "Only until you are fully back on your feet. Nothing changes permanently. It simply allows me to sign routine business documents without interrupting your recovery." Naomi was arranging fresh flowers near the window, quietly listening without lifting her eyes. Victoria opened the portfolio and placed several neatly organized pages across the bedside table. "Everything has already been reviewed. The attorneys only need your signature." Ethan studied the first page but frowned after only a few lines. The legal language was dense, far more complicated than the straightforward business agreements he normally approved. Before he could continue reading, Victoria gently placed a pen beside the papers. There is no reason to tire yourself by reading every paragraph. I have already taken care of all the details. Naomi slowly turned from the window. Her heart beat faster than usual, but her voice remained calm and respectful. Excuse me, Miss Sinclair. Victoria glanced toward her with visible surprise. Yes. Naomi chose every word carefully. Mr. Moretti has always been known for reading every document before signing it. I believe he would prefer to finish reviewing these first. For a brief moment the room became completely silent. Victoria's pleasant smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Thank you, Naomi, she replied evenly. This is a legal matter. Naomi lowered her head respectfully. Yes, ma'am. I only meant that Mr. Moretti has always valued understanding every decision with his own eyes. Ethan looked from Naomi to the papers resting before him. Something inside him shifted. During the past several months, nearly everyone had encouraged him to depend on others, yet Naomi had never once suggested surrendering responsibility for his own choices. He slowly closed the folder without signing a single page. I will read everything first, he said quietly. Victoria blinked, clearly caught off guard. The attorneys are waiting downstairs. Ethan met her eyes with calm confidence that had been absent for months. Then they can wait a little longer. Victoria forced another polite smile, collected herself, and carried the portfolio back into the hallway with noticeably slower steps than when she had entered. The bedroom door closed softly behind her. Ethan remained silent for several moments before looking toward Naomi. You believed I should not sign. Naomi answered honestly. I believe important decisions deserve patient minds, not rushed moments. Ethan nodded slowly. It was the first major decision he had made entirely on his own since his accident, and although no contracts had been signed that morning, something far more important had quietly returned. For the first time in many months, Ethan trusted his own judgment again, and the person who had helped him find it was not standing beside him as an advisor or an executive, but as the woman who had never stopped protecting his dignity one thoughtful choice at a time. The decision not to sign the documents changed the atmosphere inside the mansion almost overnight. Conversations became quieter whenever Ethan's wheelchair approached the hallway. Meetings that had once stretched late into the evening suddenly ended behind closed doors, and several advisors who had not visited Ethan in months unexpectedly requested time to speak with him. Instead of accepting every explanation placed before him, Ethan began asking for reports to be brought directly to his room. He read every page carefully, making notes in the margins just as he had before his accident. Naomi never offered legal advice, but she quietly organized the files, arranged them in chronological order, and made certain nothing disappeared before Ethan finished reviewing it. One afternoon, an independent attorney whom Ethan had trusted for many years arrived at the mansion carrying several folders that had not passed through Victoria's office. The attorney sat beside Ethan for more than 2 hours, patiently explaining every document that had recently been prepared. As each page was examined, a troubling pattern slowly emerged. Temporary authorizations had gradually expanded into long-term control. Routine management powers had quietly become permanent authority over major assets. None of the language was openly deceptive, yet every revision moved Ethan farther away from the responsibility he had spent his life building. When the attorney finished speaking, the room became silent. Ethan closed the final folder and rested his hand upon it for several moments before looking toward the window where the winter sunlight reflected across the frozen gardens. Thank you for bringing these directly to me, he said quietly. The attorney nodded with respectful understanding. I believed you deserved the opportunity to make your own decisions. After he departed, Victoria entered the room with confident steps, expecting another routine conversation. Instead, she found the folders neatly stacked beside Ethan's chair. She immediately recognized the documents. I can explain everything, she began calmly. Ethan raised his hand, not in anger, but with quiet composure. There is no need. His voice remained steady. I have already read every page. Victoria attempted another reassuring smile. Everything I did was intended to protect your future. Ethan looked at her with sadness rather than resentment. Protecting someone never requires preventing them from understanding the truth. Those words settled heavily inside the room. Victoria lowered her eyes for the first time since his accident, realizing that the man she believed had become dependent on everyone else had quietly reclaimed something far more important than physical strength. She offered no further argument. Within the following days, the proposed agreements were withdrawn, the management structure was revised under Ethan's direct supervision, and every important decision once again required his personal approval. No dramatic confrontation echoed through the mansion. No raised voices filled the hallways. Justice arrived with signatures carefully reviewed instead of blindly accepted, with truth calmly spoken instead of loudly declared. As life slowly returned to a healthier balance, Ethan noticed that Naomi behaved exactly as she always had. She never mentioned the documents. She never accepted praise for encouraging him to wait. She simply continued placing fresh flowers beside his bed every Monday morning, preparing his favorite breakfast, and asking permission before adjusting his chair. One evening, while watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the gardens, Ethan finally understood something that had escaped him throughout his years of success. Loyalty was never measured by who stood beside him when he held power. It was measured by who quietly protected his dignity when he could no longer protect it himself. And in the entire mansion, only one person had done that every single day without expecting anything in return. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing the pale winter skies with warm sunlight that poured through the tall windows of the Moretti estate. The gardens that had seemed frozen only months before were once again filled with blooming roses, trimmed hedges, and the gentle sound of fountains that echoed across the stone courtyard. Recovery had never come quickly, but every week brought another small victory. Ethan Moretti continued attending physical therapy with quiet determination, refusing to measure progress by dramatic milestones. Instead, he celebrated the simple moments that once seemed impossible. The ability to move a little farther. The strength to sit unassisted a little longer. The confidence to believe tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Naomi never applauded those victories with loud excitement. She simply noticed every one of them. She adjusted his schedule so he could spend more time outside when the weather was pleasant. She placed comfortable walking shoes beside his chair long before he needed them, believing preparation was another form of hope. She never asked whether he would walk again. She behaved as though one day he naturally would. Then one bright Saturday morning, surrounded by his physical therapist, a few longtime employees, and the familiar faces who had remained genuinely loyal, Ethan asked everyone for a few moments of privacy except Naomi. He rested both hands on the sturdy support bars installed beside the therapy room windows and took a slow, steady breath. His first attempt lasted only a second before he settled back down. The second lasted a little longer. On the third attempt, with quiet determination replacing fear, Ethan pushed upward until he was standing on his own feet. His legs trembled, and his balance remained uncertain, but he was standing. The room fell completely silent. Naomi instinctively took a small step forward, ready to help if he asked, yet she stopped herself because she knew he deserved the chance to choose his own next step. Ethan looked toward her, smiled softly, and with patient determination took one careful step. Then another. They were not perfect steps, nor were they easy, but each one carried far more than physical effort. They carried months of perseverance, quiet dignity, and the belief that a person's worth had never depended upon what they could accomplish alone. When he finally reached Naomi, he did not extend his hand as an employer greeting an employee. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes and said, "Thank you for never treating me like I had become less than the man I was." Naomi's smile reflected the same quiet humility she had shown from her very first day in the mansion. "I only treated you the way every person deserves to be treated, sir." A few weeks later, Ethan invited the household staff, business advisors, and close friends to a small luncheon in the estate's grand dining room. At the end of the gathering, he surprised everyone by pulling out the chair beside his own seat and inviting Naomi to join him at the table. The room grew still as every eye turned toward the woman who had once entered the mansion carrying nothing more than a housekeeping cart and a kind heart. She hesitated politely, but Ethan simply smiled. "This place is not reserved for titles," he said. "It is reserved for those who stood beside this family when character mattered more than status." Naomi quietly accepted the invitation, not with pride, but with gratitude. In that peaceful moment, no one remembered who had held the greatest authority or the largest fortune. They remembered the woman who had protected another person's dignity when it would have been easier to look away. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the room with quiet warmth, everyone present understood a truth that would remain long after the meeting ended. Power may build an empire, but kindness is what keeps a human heart standing. And that day the world remembered exactly what dignity looks like.